This week, we're looking at a remarkably rich period in English history, and one that's rich, too, in the whole story of the development of English furniture. We begin in 1603. That was the year Queen Elizabeth died. The Stuart period had begun, and in the 80 years or so that we're tracing in this programme, we have the Gunpowder Plot, Shakespeare still at his most prolific, a growing trade with the Far East, there was the Civil War, scientific discovery by men like Newton and Boyle, the Plague, the Great Fire of London. In the world of architecture, Inigo Jones and Sir Christopher Wren are at work, and in the art world, Rubens and Van Dyck. Now, the period between the accession of James I and the establishment of the Commonwealth under Cromwell in 1649 is normally referred to in English furniture as Jacobean. So let's begin then with the early years of the 17th century. The reign of James I saw a movement away from the elaborate decoration of Elizabethan times and towards simpler lines and greater comfort. And it really is from this time onwards that you begin to find upholstery in English furniture as we would recognise it today. Now, this particular chair is from the early years of the 17th century. It's still remarkably covered in its original velvet. But this wasn't a common chair, even in the 17th century. It was owned by a wealthy man. A little later in the period, this chair and this particular form of decoration and covering is known as turkey work, and it takes that name directly from its influence, which was, of course, Turkish carpets. And then, throughout history, styles of dress were influencing the design of furniture. Now, this kind of chair was made to accommodate the voluminous skirts worn by fashionable ladies of the period. And it's since become known as the farthingale chair. Incidentally, don't be put off by this covering. That was obviously done much later. Well, the English furniture makers of the period certainly weren't lacking in imagination. This became known as the monk's bench, but that doesn't even begin to describe it. You see, it's so many pieces of furniture in one. A bench, yes, with a straight back, but lift up the seat and it becomes a chest for storing things, and then this back is deceptive too, because it very quickly turns itself into a table. Wasn't even used by monks. But the craftsmen of the 17th century had greatly improved their techniques since medieval times. And the craft and trade guilds not only protected the special skills of their members, but they also carried out very strict tests to make sure that their standards were maintained. The work of the turner is of particular significance in the 17th century. Those massive bulbous supports of Elizabethan times, often in the form of the elaborately carved cup and cover like this, well, these were now being thinned down, and at the same time they were losing their carved decoration. In many cases, they became virtually plain pillar supports. As the century progressed, however, the turners developed and perfected all sorts of variations, and eventually, in the second half of the 17th century, the attractive spiral turning was developed that today we call the barley sugar twist. Now, the vital piece of equipment for the turner was, of course, his lathe, and the kind that was in common use for centuries, both before and after this period, was the pole lathe. The turner would invariably work out in the woods and forests with the raw material to hand, as the pole lathe was eminently suitable for turning new or green wood. A variety of small hand tools would be used to cut, split, and prepare the timber for turning.
Stuart King is one of the few craftsmen to have mastered once more the techniques which virtually died out only 30 or 40 years ago. All the tools he uses were doing their job long before he was born. The pole lathe itself is very simple. A cord attached at one end to a foot treadle and at the other to a springy pole is twisted once around the piece of wood before it's centred between the lathe pockets, which hold it in place. Every time the treadle is pressed and released, the wood rotates backwards and forwards, and the cutting is done on the downward stroke when the work rotates towards the chisel. A fork between two tree branches makes an excellent fulcrum for the pole itself. A carefully chosen springy bough, often of larch. The heavier end is, of course, anchored to the ground. Using 2 or 3 different-sized gouges, the work is soon brought to a rough shape. But great care has to be taken to keep the cord away from the cutting area, as it's all too easily severed. Then, finally, a broad, flat-bladed chisel is used to produce a smooth finish, before the embellishments are added. When you see how efficient it is in the hands of an expert, it's perhaps not so surprising that such an apparently crude arrangement as the pole lathe stood the test of time so well. It was extremely portable, could produce turned items of high quality, and in the right hands its productivity could be quite staggering. 400 or 500 chair legs like this could be made in a week by a skilled turner.
Quite remarkable that, isn't it? So simple and yet so very clever. And this is what they turned, of course. Here's a good example. Not only the leg, but coming right through the square to form the uprights of the arms. And this, a nice, simple, but just a nice chair. Solid seat, solid panel back, all the same as we've seen before, except this one has a date, which is original, 1612, and that makes that nice. But sort of viewing these two, do you get the idea this one's all skimpy and all something's the matter with it? And when you look at it, you begin to see, because on all old bits of furniture here, no change whatever in the colour. This has been knocked about, bruised, and come through many years. No change at all, but look at this. Here you see, look at this arm. It's a beautiful arm for showing how wrong it is. Black as ink up here. Well, it's all been stained black. This was stained black as well. Still stays in the bit of carving on the arm, but look where it's been used. All gone. You can't rub off age. That's not possible. So this chair must be relatively modern, a copy. And if you look in detail at it, and one needs to look in detail at everything, everywhere there are white lines and white edges, all along the top, all along there, all along the front, and you can see where they rested some feet on it. Look at that, advertising the fact beyond any doubt whatever that that is a copy. Not so with this fella, because no white edges here, plenty of square edges to look. The hutch, a bread hutch, a food hutch, everything in this top half pierced. The door, of course, with open spindles, the arcading pierced right through, whole idea of getting air in. Pierced all through the corners, pierced all down the sides. The #1 refrigerator, if you like, the only means they had of trying to get a little air in to save their food from going putrid. Nice hanging hutch, that, absolutely untouched. And these boxes are simple. Bible boxes, people call them. I like to think a Bible box is more of a flat rectangular thing, because although you could have got a Bible in here, it's got some little drawers, the feature here is all contained in the front. There you see the former owner's initials, WF, not the maker, made especially for Mr. WF. Pretty little carved bit of anno, and look at those lovely figures there, 1657. Look how nicely they're cut early, and no white edges. And here's a smaller one still, which a lot of people might call a Bible box. I think a reading desk. Again, little drawers. This one's got a little special feature in it because they put all sorts of things in here, jewels and the lot. And there are 2 pegs inside there, which I've taken out in order to show you a secret drawer. See that, how nice that is? Look at that oak. There, just dirty with age, but unstained, no black stain. This is what old bits of furniture look like, because when these things were made, I've no doubt about it, they were absolutely brand new. You didn't have to stain them to make them look old. They were brand new. So was this in about 1650. See, the turner's been at it again. They were all raised on early turn legs, dressers like this, with no backs. None of this business of open shelves or panelled backs. This is the first type of dresser, and very nice they are, make lovely bits of furniture. And here, I'll show you the way they make the drawer. Here, now they've learned to make these crude dovetails, which they show right through to the very front. And you can see there's been an applied piece of wood put on, which in point of fact was a moulding worked on a bench. And they just put these mouldings around like that, and that covered up those rather crude, funny-looking through dovetails. And when they got busy, and really got busy, look what they produced then. See, here is the original piece of moulding, just put on simply. Take no notice of the inlay for the moment, but look what they did when they mitered them. And look how they raised the middle panel And look what they turn. That's one deep drawer. Just look at that. There's a drawer front. And the same arrangement down here on the cupboard doors, which enclose 3 long drawers like that. This is the first type of chest of drawers, round about 1650 again. And you notice the inlay, crude, mother of pearl and bone. And, oh, well, that's nicer still. There's actually the original date, 1658. And isn't that nice? That's a beautiful chest. And, of course, it's so difficult to keep these things in strict order, date-wise, because here we got a Cromwellian chair and table. Credence table, with the usual sort of bowed legs. And look at this for a chair. My word, some strength here. No pretty silk damask, no fear, not with Cromwell. Leather, brass nails. Well, there we are, just about up to the end of the Cromwellian period.
Well, in 1660, the monarchy was restored, and Charles II returned from the continent to a rapturous reception. He and his retinue in exile had become enthused with the sparkle and gaiety of the courts of Europe, and in particular the opulence and splendour surrounding the French king, Louis XIV. Well, this, together with the general reaction of the public against the stern asceticism of the Commonwealth period, provided really an ideal climate for the arts and crafts to flourish. Now, among the wealthy, the Restoration period produced a demand for luxury and flamboyance, and so luxury furniture, like this sleeping chair, was devised, where the back can be raised or lowered on a ratchet according to the way you want it. And flamboyant carved and gilded furniture like this, or suites of furniture completely covered in ornately worked silver, illustrate the spirit of the time so well. And when you think of this period, you can't help associating it particularly with the diarists, and as regards furniture, it was John Evelyn who was the first writer to use the term cabinet maker, which he did as early as 1664. And of course, there was the even more famous Samuel Pepys, who was to make the first reference to bookcases as separate pieces of furniture. Now, this is one typical example of the earliest kind, the kind, in fact, that Pepys himself ordered from Simpson the joiner. And Pepys was a man far too fond of his money to spend it on mere passing fashions. An increasing interest in science also began to make its mark on the domestic interior, and one important event in this respect was the granting of a charter to the Royal Society by Charles II in 1662. Now, by this time, work had begun on developing the barometer, but the most significant development, as far as the furniture maker was concerned, was the long case designed to protect the hanging weights and cords of clocks. This was probably the very first English long case clock. It was originally fitted with a short bob pendulum when it was made in about 1659 by Ahasuerus Fromentil, who'd sent his son over to Holland to find out the secrets of the pendulum, because it was a Dutchman who'd first applied the pendulum principle to clocks only a year or so before. Well, a few years later, Fromentil himself put in the subsequently developed long pendulum, which stretched the entire height of the case and gave much more accurate timekeeping. And incidentally, the term grandfather clock, which we use so commonly, only became common in Victorian times after a popular music hall song. Well, now, in talking about the development of English furniture, you can never really ignore what's going on in the world outside. The 17th century was to see a tremendous expansion of world trade. Over 100 years previously, the Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and he really started something. The seagoing merchant nations of Europe were in fierce competition with each other to establish trading stations in the Far East, in India, China and Japan. And one company in particular was to have a really profound effect on the development of this trade with the Orient, and through that, the development of English furniture. It was in the ships of the East India Company that so many of the products of the East were brought back to England. Indeed, the company was set up for the very purpose of exploiting that trade, in competition particularly with the Dutch, who claimed exclusive rights in the East. It was regarded as so important that the company had been granted a monopoly on it by royal charter in 1600, and by 1614, the East India Company had 24 ships. But they were by no means just cargo carriers. They remained very much fighting vessels, and many an English East Indiaman lightened the load of Dutch vessels carrying similar cargoes back to Europe. It was as a result of this trade, for instance, that we started to import porcelain from China, hence the word China, which we still use commonly today. We also imported lacquered goods from, among other places, Japan, and the art of lacquering became known as Japanning. Although it's interesting that because of a general lack of geographical knowledge, added to the fact that it was the East India Company that brought those goods back, the term India or India work was also commonly used. Well, these Oriental influences, these Eastern styles of decoration, proved to be so popular that English craftsmen began to imitate them, and chinoiserie, as it's called, continued as a fashionable form of decoration throughout the 18th and into the 19th century. One particularly attractive and most opportune idea that came from India was canework, and it became popular largely because of that terrible disaster, the Great Fire of London in 1666. And it really was a disaster of mammoth proportions. More than 13,000 houses burnt to the ground, 200,000 people left homeless. In his account, Samuel Pepys describes everybody endeavouring to move their goods by flinging them into the river or bringing them into lighters that lay off. Nonetheless, of course, nearly all the furniture in those houses was destroyed. And so an active market grew up for a new and cheap kind of chair, and it was the Indian-inspired chair with the caned seat and back that provided the answer. It wasn't long before more ornate styles were developed, and the cane chair makers found themselves producing chairs and other seating furniture for some of the finest houses in England. Although production was based in London, it would seem that other chair makers in the home counties soon began to follow the fashion, a fashion which lasted well into the 18th century.
And you know, people became attracted to these new style of chair, the cane seats and backs. How different they were from the rather massive, solid, square panel back and solid seat. Now we get the innovation of a new wood, more or less. There was always walnut about, but it's used rather a lot in Charles II's time. And once more, no opportunity was lost in reminding people that the monarchy was back. Here is the top rail, you see, just pretty, little S-shaped scrolls, a crown in the middle. And always on this type of chair, there's a central stretcher down below there where the same motif is repeated. So a nice armchair, a nice Charles II single chair, where virtually not much difference, nothing much to say differently, except here we got two little cherubs supporting the crown, and now, of course, just the same central stretcher running between those legs down there. You've noticed now also the backs get up, high back chairs, and this again in walnut, and once more, no crown here, but nevertheless this curious motif here repeated down below, just as we now expect. And here's a dear little chair. These child's chairs are very rare, as you would expect. And here we have the same idea, crown, two cherubs, and this is adjustable, this little footrest. 1 year old, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right down to there. So you see, in use all the time. And look at that rail. I think that's beautiful. You can see this child all over these years, kicking, 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 smashed the crown, broke the cherubs' heads off, but nice and round and smooth. Obviously been in use a long, long while. And this needs repeating once more. I'd like to repeat it every time I come on television. No stain. This obviously is a replacement. There it is. You can see the black stain, and you can see all the white edges down here. So that's been faithfully reproduced, but nevertheless is a replacement. Here's a new sort of thing that appeared. This daybed, as it's called. Really a huge cane panel, and just adjustable head here, but only for about 3 or 4 inches. What I like about this are these lovely barley sugar twists. They appear before, but there's nothing like a Charles twist somehow or the other. It's so different to the modern twist of today, and you see that's really all twist, as is this little table. And although there were smaller tables in Elizabethan and earlier times than this, it's really at this period that the families decided no longer to eat with their staff. In former days, they ate all round large refectory tables in the dining hall, but now they leave the staff go to their quarters, and the family move into a small room, an eating room, a dining room, and it's necessary, of course, they have smaller tables. So little gate legs like this appear. And isn't that pretty? Just look how lively that all is underneath. See, all those twists and twisted rails, absolutely lovely, and all in walnut. There's a lovely walnut top. Bit unusual, a gate leg in walnut. They're nearly always in oak, such as this little fellow, possibly for tea. But you see the same idea here, bobbin turnings, but absolutely alive there. Really, one could sit and look at that and see all sorts of different ideas and patterns. Oh, we could sit and look at it for a long while. But that's how they came, and this is why this sort of table is much sought for. Here's a curious sort of thing called a coaching table. It has a narrow bed, something like a Sutherland table now, and, of course, a deep flap. I think they used to run out with them when the coaches arrived at the coaching inns and just stuck them up like that. There is a gate that side, perhaps for drinks while they change horses. But they're coaching tables as ever was. And you see, there's a sort of a side table. Do you remember that credence table with its straight edges? Now, curved lines. Furniture's beginning to bend a bit and people like it. And that just makes that pleasant. You see the stretcher not being straight carries the shape of the top all round and makes a most attractive table. And here, well, no longer a writing box, or if you like to say, a large Bible box, but the first type of bureau. Little crude, nothing much inside, but early. Early because always the top overhangs. Now you see the way this top, this table, it's all been made at the same time, but it overhangs the frame. And all bureaus around about this time, where you get them later on veneered in walnut and smothered in marquetry, they'll all have overhanging tops. And this interests me because obviously this, I should think, was made in the country somewhere as against London, because basically it's all made in walnut except that flap. And it seems to me this fellow hadn't got a wide enough plank of walnut wood to use, so he used elm. And he clamped it so it didn't warp. And that just interests me that and it's absolutely old. So it's just nice and well, it's got a lovely colour. Just look at it.
So this brings us now, Arthur, really almost to the end of the 17th century.
It does indeed, within something like 10 or 12 years.
Well, the subject of our programme next week will take us right to the end of the 17th century, because we're going to talk about the development of the English craftsmen during the reign of William and Mary, and that in turn takes us to the threshold of what we might call the golden age of English furniture. So until then, from Arthur and me, goodbye.
Go beyond the velvet rope of our most beautiful historic homes and meet the people saving our priceless heritage. Hidden Treasures of the National Trust on BBC iPlayer.